Back to Tack and Track, guys. I'm Brad, and today we're going to be talking about the 1903 Springfield, the 1903 Springfield A3, and the A4. Today we're going to be covering the Springfields as we continue down our World War II firearms. If you guys have been following us covering these guns, we're going to be doing this one a little bit differently. If you haven't been following us for this, please subscribe down below. We're going to be covering a lot of World War II firearms ahead of a shoot where we're going to put a lot of these guns up against each other in a head-to-head style competition. So I said we were going to be doing this a little bit differently than we've done in the past. We're actually going to start with the 1903 Springfield and cover its development and design and this particular rifle in its World War I configuration. Then we'll cover design changes and the World War II variant A3 over here. We'll also briefly talk about the A4. But we're going to cover this one, and we're going to head all the way back to its design, and we're going to get a little bit ahead of World War II by covering this World War I rifle, because its development is important to understanding the A3. And we'll talk about the design changes between the 1903 and the 1903 A3. Alright, so before we can talk about the 1903 Springfield, we've got to go all the way back to 1898. The U.S. enters the Cuban War of Independence. We call this the Spanish-American War. We handily defeat the Spanish, but in the process, we run into early Mausers. That's what the Spanish are using at the time. The U.S. is using the kreg. And we take a look at these early Mausers, and we look at that and we say, that's a mighty fine gun. We wish we had something like that. The kreg, on the other hand, was kind of released into U.S. forces before the design was really finalized, and that's something that the U.S. will do a good job of when adopting the 1903 Springfield, is spending some time and a little bit more development into the gun before releasing it to kind of get a finalized design. The kreg has this awkward side load magazine in it that you just kind of pour rounds into, and doesn't have a real good development in the magazine. They also really don't have standardized sights. They bounce back and forth between several standardized sights, and it kind of makes a mismatch of rifles. It's very hard to train everybody on because all these rifles are different. So the U.S. takes a look at these Mauser designed rifles. They say, we really like that. They start design and development of their own rifle at Springfield. And these rifles infringe upon a lot of the patents that Mauser has. So the U.S. contacts Mauser. They come to a fairly easy agreement with Mauser. And Mauser ends up getting awarded 75 cents a rifle and 50 cents for every 1,000 clips produced for the rifles. Now, after the Mauser debacle and them getting a patent there, the parent company for Mauser actually sues the U.S. for the use of the Spitzer bullet that we take for granted today because they are so common. This was a fairly new round at the time, and the parent company for Mauser actually had a patent on the round itself. So with all that out of the way, we can take a look at this rifle, the 1903 in its World War I configuration. Alright, with the Spanish-American War out of the way, the kreg out of the way, and all the patents being discussed and talked about, we can finally talk about the rifle we all came here to talk about today, the 1903 Springfield. We're not going to talk about the early changes to the 1903, but this design really wasn't locked in until about 1906. The early ones were chambered in 30-03 before we finally settle on the 30-06 cartridge and see the rifle that we see here today. So this is a 8.7 pound battle rifle with a 24-inch barrel. The barrel length is something that makes this rifle a little bit unique. At the time, most other nations were working on a pair of rifles. They had a cavalry carbine and a shorter barrel, usually around 20 inches, and then they had a longer barreled variant for their standard issue troops. The U.S. found a happy medium here, and this is something that we'll see adopted by most of the countries. By the middle of World War II, by the end of World War II, we'll see an intermediate rifle getting developed by almost everybody and not two separate rifles. So for size comparisons, let's put this up against a Mosin Nagant so we can kind of look at the size difference between those two rifles. We look at a full barrel length standard infantry version, and we'll put it up against a Type 38 later rifle by the Japanese to get you an idea on what cavalry-sized carbines looked like at the time. So we can see the Springfield kind of fits that nice intermediate package. It's a very well balanced rifle, it's a handy rifle, and this 24-inch barrel that's suitable for both cavalry and your standard infantry simplifies design. So the main problem with the Springfield 1903 is simply a lack of rifles. So throughout World War I, most US troops actually end up fighting with the M1917, which is really a Lee Enfield chambered in 30-06. Now this Lee Enfield is going to weigh heavily on the designs of the A3 that we'll get to in a minute, but it is what most troops fight with, even though the 1903 was the standard rifle for the US Army at the time. Alright, so let's take a look at the overall rifle. Then we're going to cover 3 parts of this rifle in a little bit of detail. We're going to talk about the action, the sights, and the magazine and magazine cutoff in a little bit of detail. But before we do that, let's talk about the rifle overall. Of course, up front, no muzzle device this early. We've got a front blade style sight that is not hooded. We've got a handguard that's going to completely envelop this barrel. Nice finger grooves for your offhand to kind of have some meat to grab onto. One of the things we'll also see is this cut in the top of the wood here for these kind of unique sights. We'll talk about the sights in detail. Pretty standard trigger guard, and then pretty standard style stock setup. It does have 3 swing swivels for your rifle sling. Overall, this rifle has a very, very good balance and a very, very good feel. So let's get started on talking about some of these things in a little bit of detail. And we'll start with the sights, because the sights are going to be important as we see changes happen to this rifle over time. And it's certainly something we need to talk about with wartime style use. So let's take a deep dive into the sights. These sights are extremely good on a beautiful summer's day shooting a match style competition. These are the kind of sights that you want for something like that. At night, in a trench, under fire, these are not the sights you want. They make target acquisition slow. The fine adjustments on the sights are really something that's not usable, and you could literally teach a college level full semester class on how to use these sights and how to be effective with them, which is great for a professionally trained marksman, a soldier with years of experience. These are great sights for that. Let's be honest, World War I and World War II were fought with teachers from Toledo, Ohio, and dockyard workers from Louisiana, not guys with 20 years of experience dialing in sights like these, and they were usually fought in adverse conditions. You didn't get to pick a warm, sunny day to try and use these sights. And we'll see that throughout most of the war, the 1903 is unavailable to most troops. So they're using that Enfield that we talked about earlier. The Enfield's got a peep style sight that, while is significantly less precise and not really match grade style sight, is a much better battle sight than what we see on this guy. So the rear sights on the 1903 Springfield have a few different setups. We can drop this rear sight flat, and there's actually a very small notch cut into the height adjustment for the ladder sight that we can use with this sight completely flat up against the rifle. It's a very, very small notch. It is very good for finding a precise target in good weather, good lighting. And that's going to be a routine theme of talking about the sights. So when we flip it up, we've got a nice ladder sight. Now, one of the problems with the kreg, and they looked at several different sights on the kreg, one of the problems with the kreg, though, is they'd often get caught on the cavalry versions as they tried to pull them out of the scabbard on a horse because they had ladder-style sights. So this ladder-style sight on the Springfield can be folded up like we see here, then it can be folded down correctly into position. But if this rifle sight gets bumped the wrong direction, it's okay, it's not going to damage the sight, it's not usable like this, but it's not going to be damaged laying flat this way. So it's okay to bump it the wrong direction. This front knob here will adjust windage, and we've got a lot of adjustment for windage in this sight, and it is very precise and fine, and its movement would really allow a shooter to get a very, very precise dialed in windage on it. So as we flip this sight up here, we'll give you guys a close-up of this. We can see this sight is, like most sights of the time period, set up for completely unreasonable ranges. It's up to 2,800 yards. So that's an unusable range distance, but the sight itself is extremely usable. And if I was going to pick any of the era rifles to try and take some precise long distance shots with, it would most definitely be one of these Springfields like this. With that being said, I mean, I think absolute max to try and take any kind of reasonable shot, tops 1,200 yards. I mean, just absolute tops, and I wouldn't even want to try that, but I could see that being done with how good these sights are. So we've got very fine adjustments on this height adjustment here, and we can see 3 distinct style setups. So up top, we've got this groove cut into the top bar here. As we go down, we'll see another notch cut just below this triangle, and we've got a peep sight. So the really cool thing about this sight is you can set it up and actually have 4 different ranges pre-dialed into your rifle, which is great if you've got an enemy advancing from a trench towards you. You can have one sight that's set at their trench distance, right? Then you can have one that's set somewhere in no man's land. You can have another that is closer to you, and then you can drop this sight down and have a very close range style set up with this top notch. So with the sights out of the way, let's take a look at this action. So the action on this rifle is, of course, like we talked about earlier, very, very Mauser-esque. It's a cock-on open design, which means as we bring this bolt handle up, it's actually going to cock the firing pin on the rifle. It's got very large extractor on the side, very reminiscent of the Mauser. And we'll actually take a look at the Mauser, then the 1903 Springfield, and we'll throw a Type 38 up here so we can kind of look at the big extractors that we see on all 3 that are kind of inherent of that Mauser style design. We see 2 big locking lugs up top, just like what we see on the Mauser. However, the Springfield, unlike the K98 that we're looking at here, does have a 3rd locking lug on the back of it in the event of a failure of that action. Now, one of the things that makes this a little bit different than the K98 bolt that we're looking at there is the 1903 Springfield can be manually cocked. So we can pull back on the back side of the bolt here, and I'll actually drop this for you guys. Okay, so with this rifle not cocked, I can pull this firing pin back and cock the rifle. That works great if you've had a bad primer or a light primer strike. You don't have to go through the process of opening the action in order to recock the rifle. With that being said, I'm doubtful on whether or not this was actually useful, because in any kind of stress situation, I'm just going to dump that round and grab a fresh one. But it was a feature that was integrated into the rifle design that was important. The safety is a little bit different than the safety that we see on the K98. It only has 2 positions. So position 1 is, of course, fire. Position 2 is safe. We flip it over here to safe. we will notice that the action doesn't open, it doesn't move. We can't do anything with this action at all with the rifle in safe. In order to open the action, we actually have to flip the rifle to fire, then we can open the action. Whereas the K98, we've got that third position that we talked about in the K98 video. So the next really interesting feature about this rifle, and one of the things that makes it unique for Mauser style designs, is the magazine cutoff. So let's take a look at that and how that works. The magazine portion of this rifle is something that was really important and one of the major reasons for the US adopting this. We kind of talked about it earlier, but the Kreg has a very bad magazine design. This magazine is stripper clip fed, holds 5 rounds, and has a cutoff. When we looked at the Kreg, it had this weird opening door on the side that you kind of poured rounds into, and you just kind of had to fumble them in there and hope that they set correctly, and it wasn't a very good design. So the addition of stripper clips to feed the rifle and this flush fit internal magazine were a big deal. So the US wanted a flush fit magazine, so they didn't have to worry about these magazines being damaged when soldiers ran them into things. They didn't have to worry about them getting bent as people rested stuff on them. So they wanted a flush fit internal magazine. What they were able to fit was a 5-round magazine in these, and they're fed by stripper clips, Mauser stripper clips. By the way, you can use K98 stripper clips on your 1903. They work. So you can use Mauser stripper clips. We actually have US stripper clips here. But these rifles also come with a cutoff switch where we see the takedown lever. It's on the left side of the gun. It's where we see in most Mauser designs a takedown lever for us to be able to pull the bolt. And this switch works to turn the magazine on and off, as well as being able to remove the bolt. So in its down position, the magazine is off, which means I can load the magazine with 5 rounds, and then I can individually feed the rifle. And every time I run that bolt back, it's not going to pick up a fresh round out of the magazine. I can lay one in the action, close that action, fire that round, eject that round, hand load another one, and there's still 5 rounds left in reserve in the bottom of my rifle. This is worked under the design that soldiers will be able to fire, reload their rifle, fire, reload their rifle, and then when the 5 rounds in the magazine is needed, they'll be able to flip that switch, and they've got more firepower on hand and can increase their fire rate. This works great if you think about incoming troops coming across no man's land. As they're really far out there, you can take a shot, load another shot, take a shot, reload it, take another shot, and then as they get closer, you can flip that switch, have all 5 rounds, and be able to start dumping rounds at a much faster rate. This was really important to the U.S. Ordnance Department as they were looking for a replacement for the Kreg. One of the reasons why is they wanted to be sure soldiers didn't waste ammunition. They were worried about these internal magazines getting abused and soldiers wasting ammunition. That kind of comes back to the M1 Garand, where it wasn't such a big deal anymore because the US had the industry to produce. But with this rifle, that was a big thing, is conservation of ammo and this magazine cutoff. So when we flip this magazine cutoff all the way up against the top of the receiver here, the magazine is now on. So as I pull this bolt back, push it forward, it's going to pick up a round out of that magazine, and I can go to work with all 5 rounds in that magazine. There is a third position to this switch. It's kind of an intermediate position right here. That position will allow me to remove the bolt from the rifle for cleaning or disassembly. So that solves the problem of not having a separate release button for the bolt like we see on the Mausers. So with all that out of the way, let's take a look at this particular rifle as an individual, and we'll talk about this rifle. Then from there, we'll talk about some interwar development and the A3 and A4 variants, and we'll take a look at this rifle, which will be the one that we'll be shooting in a World War II competition in just a second. So we call these Springfield rifles because Springfield's really the company that led the design process in them, not necessarily because they were made by Springfield. So this particular rifle here is a Rock Island Arsenal rifle. While it is a Springfield 1903 in design, it was actually made by Rock Island. This rifle is in incredibly good shape overall. Now, I would suspect that these top two wood pieces on this particular rifle have been replaced. Other than that, the rifle appears to be in its original configuration. The bolt is very tight. The rifling looks very, very good. I think overall this rifle is an excellent rifle. Now, if you're buying one of these to shoot, we need to talk a little bit about early 1903s and kind of the heat treating process that was done on them. So most of the early 1903s were single heat treated, and some of them have problems with the heat treating in the rifles. These receivers had a tendency to crack, and there were even case instances of receivers exploding. I think a lot of that really had to do with poor ammunition during wartime development, but the heat treating of the receivers didn't help. And I looked up the serial numbers. Serial number 285,507 from Rock Island and below, and around 850,000 and below from Springfield, all are single heat treated receivers. I certainly wouldn't shoot any hot ammunition through them. There's a lot of people that will tell you not to shoot these rifles because of that single heat treated receiver. With that being said, these rifles have seen a lot of combat. I'm under the general opinion that if they were going to explode, they would have. But I would warn you up against using really hot modern ammunition in these early run serial number Springfields. The heat treating process is something that we see corrected during the war, and those later serial numbered guns, even from World War I, are not affected by this issue. But this is a quality control issue that is most definitely something to talk about on these Springfields. So if you're going to buy one of these, you're going to shoot one of these, check the serial number, be aware, and I'm going to tell you, you probably shouldn't shoot it. However, I'm still going to shoot mine. So take that for what it's worth. And this is one of those early receiver guns. This rifle also has something a little interesting in it. Can't find any information on it, but there's actually a name, and I'll see if I can get a good picture. It's kind of hard to get a picture of. It's actually stamped onto the stock of this one. So that's a little bit unique. You find those kind of cool little details on these war guns like this. And with this gun knocked out of the way, let's talk about interwar development and the 1903 A3s and A4s, the gun that we're going to be shooting in our World War II competition. So the U.S. Ordnance Department starts taking a look at the service of the 1903 during World War I and the interwar years. They also look at the rifle they basically had to borrow from the British in order to get enough rifles in the hands of soldiers, the M1917, which is a Lee Enfield and .30-06 that a lot of U.S. troops used during World War I. And they decided, we really like this 1903, we want to keep it, but we really liked those sights on the Lee Enfield. So the sights are one of the big factors that changes from the 1903 to the 1903 A3. Now, in typical U.S. Army fashion, one of the biggest problems they have during the war is we don't have enough rifles. So as soon as the war is over, what do? They sell all their rifles. However, the Marine Corps is in a little bit more of a dire stretch, and they actually keep a lot of M1903s, and we'll see these enter combat in their World War I configuration again in World War II, and we'll see some of these rifles actually converted to the A4 variant. Now remember, in the interwar years, the US is really looking at semi-automatics, and we get the M1 Garands taking the main role. But because we learned so much from not having enough guns in World War I, we still don't have enough guns when World War II kicks off, and a lot of troops are using the 1903 Springfields. They're actually very common throughout the war in the Pacific theater. We see a lot of them used in North Africa, and then the A4 variant is seen all the way into Vietnam, being used as a sniper rifle. So let's take a look at the A3 variant here. So a lot of the design features are the same. Little bit different bayonet style mount, but very similar. We do see the addition of a hooded front sight post, something we did not see on the original 1903. We still see the magazine cutoff. The bolt design goes relatively unchanged. The stocks go through some changes, and most of the changes to the stock, like the removal of the finger grooves, are made to make production easier. We also see that this piece right here no longer is dovetailed for the sights, and we see the sights moved further back to give us a longer radius between the sights. Longer radius between sights is something that generally makes a rifle seem more accurate, just because we're able to get a better sight picture. Big changes in this rifle are to the sights. Not only have they been moved, they've also been simplified, and the range of the sights has been decreased. So we talked about 2,800 yard sights on the original 1903. These guys are set up for 800 yard sights instead of 2,800 yard sights. The adjustment is also significantly more coarse. So we don't get this fine, very precise adjustment, but these are easier for the average soldier to be able to use in combat than the sights we see on this guy. So overall, very good rifle. So let's take a look at this one in particular. So during World War II and the lead up to the war, we see a lot of other manufacturers making 1903 Springfields besides Springfield. This particular one is a smith-corana. Smith-corana is famous for making really good typewriters. They're not a gun manufacturer, but they are capable of finely machined parts and being able to assemble complicated items. Typewriters are super complicated. So they go into making guns, and they make 1903s. This particular one is a 1944 variant, and it has a kind of unique barrel. This was a commercially sourced barrel rather than one manufactured for wartime use, and this is a 6-groove smith-corana. This is a very tight action, very, very good shooting rifle. As an individual, I think this is actually the best individual rifle in the group, and is the most original of any of the rifles we'll be shooting. It's a very, very good example of a 1903 Springfield, and that 6-groove barrel is somewhat unfair. Most 1903s used during World War II were a 2-groove barrel. We do see some 4 grooves, but the 6-groove rifling does kind of make this rifle unique, and somewhat unfair for probably the average World War II 1903. With that being said, at the ranges and the way we're going to shoot this competition, I don't think that will really help this rifle in particular. But it is a really unique piece. It's a gorgeous gun. One of the things that we didn't talk about when we were talking about the differences between them is some of these machined components, like this trigger guard on this rifle, aren't as well machined as the ones that we see on the original 1903. But overall, absolutely fantastic rifle. And the US will get a lot of service out of this rifle during World War II. Now, the variant that I am not fortunate enough to have here to talk to you guys about is the 1903 A4. It's basically this rifle again, but with the sights removed or simplified, and a scope mounted to it. Now the Marines will use a separate scope from the U.S. Army, but this will be a sniper rifle that will serve the U.S. not only through World War II, but the A4 variants will actually see a lot of use in Korea, maybe even more use in Korea than they did in World War II, and we'll see this rifle pop up well throughout the Vietnam War, and it definitely serves the U.S. very, very well. So I hope you guys enjoyed checking out these guns. Don't forget to subscribe to us. We've got a bunch more World War II content coming, and we've got that World War II competition shoot coming up, and that should be a lot of fun. Thanks for checking us out today on Tack and Track.
Another bolt action gun for the lefty.
Off to a good start.
That is an immense amount of pressure.
Incredibly good to get on target, especially considering with this hooded front sight and my sunglasses, can't really see that front post. So I'm just using this hood up front and this back little peep sight to line up on my target and pull the trigger. With the sunglasses and the hooded front sight, I actually can't see that front blade at all.